give that back to you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Juniper, for that sobering and rousing presentation with thrivalism at the end of it. To segue from what we've just heard, I'd like to invite two speakers to join me on stage. I'll introduce them when they come up with me, but we're really going to have a conversation about one of the points on Tony's last slide, which is how do we move money into where it's needed most. So please join me on stage, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub and Joshua Amundsen. Like some water. Thank you both for joining me. You both had a busy schedule already this week, so you may have met them before, but I'm delighted to have you both on stage with me again to continue what Tony just kicked us off with. So some brief introductions. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University. He is the President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He's got an awesome Substack, which I really recommend you check out, called Global South Perspectives. And he's an expert in designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the Global South, build resilience, and promote equitable prosperity. Joshua, lovely to see you again. Joshua Amundsen is the co-director of the Youth Climate Justice Fund. He's a leading voice in global youth-led decision-making and has over a decade of experience championing equitable climate solutions, working alongside grassroots movements. He's also the founder, not co-founder, of the Green Africa Youth Organization. Thank you both for joining me. So to segue from what we've just heard, we're going to dive right into the meat of the problem. We've had 2 days of discussing some of the context in which we find ourselves, and I want to go straight into the question of how we frame the problem that we have today. We're hearing a lot of calls to mobilize the trillions of capital, yet the financial architecture that we currently have in the world is not delivering for the Global South. How would you articulate how the system is currently fundamentally broken, and what would a just and workable alternative system look like? Dr. Kaboub, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I'll broaden the focus a little bit away from the financial architecture, because there's a broader global economic architecture, which includes the financial architecture, the World Bank and the IMF primarily, but it also includes the trade and investment architecture, which is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It includes the international taxation architecture, which for a long time was in the hands of the OECD countries, but today it's being decolonized and is being transitioned to a UN tax convention framework. This global economic architecture, I'll give you one number that probably most people will remember after this weekend. If you divide the world into global north and global south and net out all global financial transactions, including exports and imports and illicit financial flows and interest payments, all financial transactions, the net amount, the last figure we have, is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That's money moving in the wrong direction. Now, next to that number, put the climate, the Green Climate Fund, which barely has $12 billion in it. Next to it, put the Loss and Damage Fund, which barely has $700 or $800 million in it. We're not serious about a just transition. Put next to it the annual profits of the top fossil fuel companies in the global south. Not even close, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong about the global economic architecture. And it's very simple. This architecture was established during colonial times for colonial purposes, for extractive purposes. That 2 trillion number has been accelerating over the last 20 years. So it's a design. It's not a flaw in the system. So how do we undo the global economic architecture? It's by undoing the economic roles that were imposed on the global south by design. And that can be summarized in 3 points, and I'll close here. Number one, the global south was supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. We still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, partnership, but effectively it locks you at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is by design, and we still play that role today. So why do we today expect the same economic architecture that was not designed for justice or development or human rights or a just transition? Why do we expect it to deliver with billions or trillions, to deliver change, to deliver a just transition? It cannot by design. So the focus of all the climate negotiations and all these discussions is really a series of tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism designed to avoid the serious discussion about structural decolonization. And that's why I always say you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet.
Thank you. Joshua, what would you add to that in terms of the framing of the problem and the work that you do? And maybe you can reflect a bit on your experience on the ground, how that colonized economic system is impacting the work that you do.
It's very difficult to speak after Fadhel. He's fantastic. Let's give it to him again. That was really great. Love it. I will talk a little bit on philanthropy and development. So you've all been to a conference before, probably, where a country announces a big amount of money, 10 billion for development work in Africa. And everyone claps, it's exciting, big commitments. And I've always wondered, where does the money go? It's like this big amount is announced and nobody knows exactly where it's gone. It's just nice numbers that are being announced. So I started looking into that, and guess what I found? So 70% of all the funding pledged by global north countries to do work in the global south goes to institutions within their own country. 70% of all that money just stays within their own country, and then only 8% goes to the countries that they are actually committing that money to. Big gap over there. I see the same with youth movements, right? I've worked with youth movements for many years, and specifically for climate. Only 1% of all climate philanthropy, actually 0.76%, goes to youth movements. And yet, for almost a decade, every or most philanthropic entities will have a report that had a young person holding a placard on their annual report saying that we need a youth movement. The same with forests and indigenous people. Many reports have made it very clear indigenous people are needed and essential for protecting our forests. Yet they get less than 1% of funding. So in development and in philanthropy, fundamentally, what has happened is that the trillions of dollars that are being advocated for, that we need to raise to do this work, is being advocated mainly to feed and supply a system that doesn't work for the communities that we are trying to support. And it's based on two fundamental things. One of them is trust. So the definition of trust, and in philanthropy there's a new thing that is growing, trust-based philanthropy, right? Which is great because it has changed the dynamic a little bit on who gets access to money. But also the question is, who is worthy to be trusted? And who defines who is a trusted person? So in the end, you get trust-based philanthropy, which is changing the game to a certain extent, but the funding is still going to people who have incredible privilege and incredible access. So for someone in Sudan, for someone in Congo, for someone in Liberia, to be able to fundraise is extremely difficult. And someone can use the same narrative and be based in Paris and raise that money very quickly. So how do we break down the power dynamics? And it comes down to access and redefining what trust means. The second thing is risk, and that is for the private sector. So I've seen so many times where we know there's a project already earmarked to happen in a country. So you go to Bangladesh, you're going to build a bridge. the money is already allocated, and there's nothing preventing them from building local skills in Bangladesh to build that bridge. But no, the investment comes with a timeline, and that timeline has to be met. So the timeline is more important than the durability of that project. So in the end, the money goes to flying people into countries, doing projects as fast as possible, and stealing away the income opportunities and real economic opportunities for people within those countries. And I think this is the reality for many young people who are having talent, skills, really looking for a place to plug in. These opportunities have been taken away from them because the current investment architecture is speed and profit. And with speed and profit, you have no time for equity and inclusion. And hence, there is injustice.
Thanks, Joshua. I think that's helped paint a really interesting and grounded picture of what is the knock-on effects of the inequity of the system. And you started to touch on some of the ways that we might change the structure of those investments, the way that we might try and build trust between different countries and different groups. What are some of the structural reforms that you think, Dr. Kaboub, that we could, or proposals that you have to put forward to try and place power back in the hands of those global South countries so we're not stuck in the cycle that you both painted?
Well, there's often discussion about external debt in the global South being the serious impediment to investments in climate action and development and health and so on. But external debt is a very serious problem, but it's actually a symptom of deeper structural issues. And in the African context in particular, it can be summarized in three major structural deficiencies. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, what I call manufacturing value-added deficits or industrialization deficits. When it comes to food deficits, according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the last report, Africa imports 85% of its food today, when less than 100 years ago, it used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. That is not by accident, it's by design. It's the heavy agricultural subsidies that have been introduced by the global north as soon as the African continent gained independence. And these are the rules of trade and investment also that create this structural trap. Number two, energy deficits. And when I say energy deficits, I include Nigeria, the biggest oil exporter on the continent. Up until recently, Nigeria imported 100% of its gasoline from abroad. Angola, the second largest exporter of oil, imports 80 or 85% of its fuel from international markets. Why? Because in the old energy system that we're trying to get rid of, by the way, we've always been denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, to refine oil. And today we're being denied, again, access to the manufacturing technology to use our own critical minerals to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy potential that we have. And access to financing. Africa attracts less than 2% of financing for renewables globally. Even though IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, has told us in its latest report that by 2040, that's like in 3 days basically, by 2040, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables, 1,000 times, and completely replace all of the continent's fossil fuel exports. Why is this not happening? Because unleashing this potential, unfortunately, is perceived as a threat to disrupt the existing economic hierarchy, not as an opportunity. And finally, the industrialization deficits that we have, the fact that we're locked at the bottom of the value chain, producing low value-added manufacturing. When you take these three structural deficits, you have a trade deficit decade after decade, which means your currencies in the global south, in Africa in particular, become weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with a weak currency, anything I import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, I import it at a more expensive cost. So I'm literally importing inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy. So that immediately puts our governments in a defensive position, trying to protect the most vulnerable. So we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we try our best to subsidize health. But that means you accumulate debt over time. So debt is the symptom of these structural issues. And the solutions are very straightforward. You invest in food sovereignty and agroecology, which is a climate solution and a debt solution. You invest in real green industrialization, which which is a climate solution and a debt solution, and you invest in our biggest potential, renewable energy infrastructure. Again, a climate solution and a debt solution. But this transformation we're talking about is technically within reach, but it's going to disrupt the existing colonial hierarchy. And this is where the red lines are. So I'll close with this. COP29 was supposed to be about climate finance. It was not. It was not even about climate. It was about an economic and geopolitical hierarchy that is not allowed to be disrupted. That is the red line of the global north countries, and that is the truth.
And I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question. In terms of the road forward that you see, and given the context of the trade turmoil that we're currently in, what does that context open up in your mind in terms of potential new trade associations, new ways of global South countries getting together to restructure?
So this current disruption moment that the United States has created is a perfect opportunity for repositioning of the global South. But it's also a frustrating moment because it's a moment where you realize that the blocks of global South countries that should be ready to organize, to reposition themselves, they're not organized. They're not even ready with a vision to reposition themselves. So you see kind of defensive mechanisms being put in place, or looking for alternative partners, whether it's Europe or China or Russia. And anybody who's stepping in to help you on a bilateral basis, they're going to help you on terms that are favorable to them. So the ideal situation is to have a block of global South countries, and I'm not talking about BRICS, excluding China actually, a block of global South countries that can organize coherent and comprehensive long-term visions for this partnership, South-South partnership on agricultural policies, but especially on industrial policies. Because Africa today has the youngest labor force on the planet, has all the critical minerals needed for the industries of the future, has the biggest renewable energy potential. What is lacking is access to life-saving technologies to manufacture renewables and clean transportation and clean cooking infrastructure, to leapfrog rather than this myth of catching up slowly. The problem is the red line of industrialization for the global north is no transfer of technology. Try to catch up. But there's one country that's willing to share technology, and that's China. And that creates an important opportunity here, not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to position Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order. And that is by what I call the possible bargain of the century. If this bloc of countries designs their own industrial policies on their terms, and then offers China this bargain saying, look, if you share technology to allow us to leapfrog, here's what you get in return. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your industrial footprint globally. You can double your geopolitical weight globally. You can secure access to these precious minerals, and you'll have access potentially to the largest market on the planet. But the problem is we don't have purchasing power yet, but if we develop and industrialize, we'll have the purchasing power to compete. Now, this bargain, again, not to put China at the top, but to trigger this bargain allows us then to engage with all European countries and the United States and all the OECD countries, say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you also share technology for wind turbine technologies, high-speed rail technologies, so that everybody can co-develop and decarbonize a global economy on terms that are favorable to the vast majority of the planet, which is the global south. And this is what I think is the small window of opportunity that the Trump administration just made even bigger. But the frustration is, where is that block that's going to strike this bargain? It's not there yet.
Thank you. Joshua, I'm going to come back to you and pick up on one of Fadhel's point around the power of the youth workforce in the Global South. I know that's an area of particular passion, focus, intention in your work. How does that proposition of the new bargaining position, how would that play out for the workforce community that you represent and that you're trying to build up in countries in the Global South?
Thanks for that, and thanks, Fadhel, for saying all that. So here's the thing, right? We are not going to meet the green transition, the just transition, and any of the climate targets if we do not build a workforce that can deliver it. The workforce we have now are not trained to deliver it. End of story, and that's why we are stuck in this cycle. We know what we want to do, but we are finding it difficult to do it because we do not have a workforce that is designed to do what we need for the future. Now, 70% of all programs in universities are training people to support the fossil fuel economy because those programs were designed 20 years ago. Now, talk to anybody who works in a university and ask them how long it takes to accredit a new course or a new program in their university. It's a nightmare. No one wants to attempt it. So we have any young people coming into a world where they're very much aware of the risk that is ahead of them, but yet our academic institutions and the entire workforce infrastructure is not designed to prepare them for that future. So this is where everything Fadhel is saying comes to play, right? And we have tested a few things. I piloted a simple thing in Africa in 4 countries and asked universities, would you introduce a new course on carbon dioxide removal? Now, not everyone believes in this anyways, but it didn't matter. The idea was pick a topic that is not so popular and ask young people in countries where they really understand what the risks are. Simple question, would you want to study this and pursue a career in this? Everyone was ready to do that. Across 4 universities on the continent, the idea was very simple. The courses they are learning now, there's no way they have opportunity to plug in the skills and the talents they are acquiring. And when they even get a place to work, they see clearly that where they are working, the gap between where they are and where we need to be is so wide as a young person. So they think 30 years ahead of their life. What is the world I want to live in? And how does my job now contribute to that? And there's a bizarre dissatisfaction leading to mental health and all sorts of problems. So this is what we got to do. A, academic reformations. We need to think about the way we restructure education systems, academic systems, to train young people in the new solutions, not the old things. New solutions, emerging technologies, and how to make that work. The second thing is we are training ourselves to believe that humans are terrible of doing good things. So when we think of everything, we think it's going to be done poorly because we have a very good track record of doing things poorly. But here's the trick. If we can raise a new generation of believing that there is good in this world and they can actually do good and they can take some of these good ideas and make them great, they will actually make them great. If we keep telling them that, oh yeah, carbon credits, we messed it up. We ejected indigenous people from their communities. So none of the solutions, solar energy, oh, tell me about it. We are keeping people in mines and they are struggling and there's labor inequality everywhere. So everything looks horrible. And it makes it feel like no matter the solution, we're just going to do it very poorly. But at the same time, we have the capacity to do it right. It's going to take another education system that trains people on how to think, on how to do things right. And then thirdly, very important, investments. Now, that is the part that is very practical, and we can all do it. And investment is not just giving resources like funding. Investment to me is also giving access. Because at the end of the day, what it comes down to is power dynamics. So Fadhel talks about the colonial structure and how that put the global south where it is. What was the key element of the colonial structure? It wasn't money, it was power. Whoever had the power was able to dictate what happens next. We have the UN now and we have the Security Council. What dictates who sits on the Security Council? Power. If we can really think about the dynamics of access and influence and build a generation where there is shared influence and shared power, we would be able to crack this and do it much faster, much durable, much equitable than we ever think. But we are stuck in the thinking that it is not possible, and that is where we are wrong.
Thanks, Josh. I think you talked really eloquently there about the not only the structural problems that Fadhel talked about, but the mental models that we're getting stuck in. Speaking of power and influence, to close, we're running out of time. I'm going to have one final question to you both, which is, imagine you're going out for dinner in Paris tonight. You can choose a group of guests. It could be one leader, it could be a group of leaders. They don't have to be French. Who would that group of leaders be, or that one leader, and what would be your one ask to them on this topic in particular? And Fadhel, I'll start with you.
Oh, there's so many people I want to have dinner with. But I'll pick the Minister of Agriculture in France because it's not very far from here. And since we're here, maybe you can go and visit the actual building. It will say the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. And the Minister of Agriculture in France during the COVID crisis and the Ukraine crisis was touring all the French media, reassuring the French public that they should not worry about the disruption of prices and supplies because France and Europe invested in its food sovereignty to produce wheat and corn and all the core crops. And he was telling the public that we should worry about our African friends who don't have food security. This is code switching. Food sovereignty for Europe, food security for Africa. Food security is a colonial term, technical term, that means you secure the nutrition of your people either by producing it yourself, which we don't, or by buying it from abroad, or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is the debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid, like during the COVID crisis. That is one of the big sources of economic entrapment, post-colonial economic entrapment. That needs to end.
I'm sure someone here can get us in touch with the Minister of Agriculture in France, so please find Fadhel after the session. Josh?
It's a very difficult question because, who would it be, right? I was going to say maybe the CEO of BlackRock and all the investment firms, but maybe not. I think that's what I would wish for. If I could get all the teenagers and very young people all in one room for one dinner, that would be my dream. And the message is going to be very simple. Don't look to the past for what you are going to do. Look to the past to learn and have confidence that you will build a better future. Because I think that we're just having so many people who are living in fear and living in the idea that it's going to fail. But it's not going to. They are going to do it, and we need to give them the confidence that they are going to do it and it's possible.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.